ever wonder how a decision made almost 200 years ago can still light the fuse on a modern conflict? Well, in Manipur, that's exactly what happened. The story of the Kuki people isn't just history, it's a living playbook for the tensions we're seeing right now.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the geopolitical chessboard and a kingdom in total crisis. Then we'll dive into the British idea of a strategic settlement and see how that turned into an actual armed force. After that, we'll tackle the really tricky part, the competing historical stories. And finally, we'll connect all those dots to what's happening today. Let's get into it.
Okay, so first up, the geopolitical chessboard. To really get why whole new communities were moved into Manipur, you've got to go back in time. We're talking the early 1800s to a kingdom that was frankly falling apart. So in the early 19th century, Manipur was in absolute turmoil. And look, we're not just talking about some minor political drama here. The kingdom had been absolutely wrecked by a Burmese invasion. Locals called it the 7 years of devastation, and for good reason. It left Manipur completely hollowed out, creating this huge power vacuum on its frontiers. And this timeline here, this is where things really change. You've got that devastating invasion from 1819 to 1826. Then the Treaty of Yondabu ends the war, and suddenly the British are on the scene. But they don't just march in and take over. Nope, it's more subtle. By 1835, they've set up a political agency right in Imphal, effectively becoming the power behind the throne. And this quote from Sir James Johnstone, a British political agent, really sums it all up. He says, "Manipur in these days could have done nothing. Why? Because of internecine quarrels. Basically, the local rulers were so busy fighting among themselves, they couldn't govern. This made them completely reliant on the British just to keep their heads above water." So you have this weak, unstable kingdom. What do the British do? Well, that brings us to our next section, a strategic settlement. This wasn't just about peacekeeping, it was a deliberate plan to reshape the population. So what exactly is a buffer zone? Well, in this context, it's pretty stark. The British idea was, frankly, to use one group of people as a human shield to protect another. They wanted to secure the valley and their own interests from raids, so they settled so-called loyal tribes right on those volatile frontiers. It was a living wall. And the man behind this whole strategy, a political agent named William McCulloch. You gotta understand, he saw the waves of Kuki migrants coming in not as a problem, but as an opportunity. He literally allotted them land specifically where, in his words, their presence would be useful on exposed frontiers. He saw a solution. And this wasn't just some random thing. McCulloch had a very clear 4-step strategy. First, pinpoint the vulnerable frontiers. Second, give land in those exact spots to the incoming Kuki migrants. Third, and this is key, give them guns, modern firearms. And fourth, their job was to act as a militia force defending that frontier. This was organized, state-sponsored resettlement with a military goal, plain and simple. All right, so they've settled people and given them guns. What's next? That brings us to the buffer and the levy. This is where the policy becomes an actual official armed force. So in 1850, they made it official. They created something called the Kuki Levy. This was basically a formal armed force made up of Kuki soldiers. It gave them jobs, it gave them purpose, and it directed their fighting skills towards protecting the interests of the Manipur Raja and, of course, the British. And this levy saw some serious action. They were sent on expeditions against other tribes like the Lushai and Mizo. They were even used to hunt down mutineers during the huge Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, and they fought right alongside Manipuri troops in major expeditions. They quickly proved themselves to be a really effective, really dependable force for the British. And we're not talking about small groups of people here. Look at this number, 2,112. That's how many refugees arrived in a massive influx in 1877 alone. This policy opened the floodgates for huge, state-managed movements of people. And check out the breakdown of that 1877 migration. You had Sukte, Meitei, Mizo, a whole mix of groups. And acting on British advice, the Maharaja gave them land in the southwestern hills. This one event, the single decision, dramatically and permanently changed the demographic map of that entire region. Forever. Okay, so the colonial records paint a pretty clear picture, right? A strategic settlement. But that's not the whole story. Not by a long shot.
Now we get into the really complicated part, the competing historical narratives. Who were these people really? Refugees? Subjects? Or were they always there?
So the British, in their classic way, tried to categorize everyone. They came up with this distinction between old Kukis and new Kukis. The old Kukis were tribes they acknowledged had been in the region for a long, long time, even showing up in old royal chronicles. But the new Kukis, those were the ones who arrived in the 19th century. And this simple classification, man, it has massive implications today for who gets to claim they're indigenous to the land.
So one side of the story, which you'll find heavily cited from British accounts, is this. The Kukis were refugees brought from Burma. They were used as porters, as mercenaries, as a buffer. This is the narrative that they were recent arrivals, brought in for a specific colonial purpose.
But there is a very strong counterargument. You'll hear from many Kuki scholars and historians that this view is, quote, the most erroneous view of a deeply subjective colonial historiography. They're essentially saying, hold on a second, that's just the British version of the story, written to justify their own actions. It totally ignores our history and presence in these hills for who knows how long.
And this perspective argues that the British weren't really historians. They were administrators. They overemphasized this idea of a migration from the South because it fit their narrative and justified their policies. They might not have had a clue, or maybe didn't care, about the tribes who were already there. The records were a tool for control, not necessarily a record of the truth.
So, after all that, you might be asking, why does any of this 19th century stuff matter now? Well, this is where it all comes together. Let's talk about the lasting colonial legacy and how those 19th century strategies created the fault lines we see in the 21st century. Think about it. The British policy was to use one tribe as a buffer against another. Historians say this literally sown the seed of enmity between groups like the Kukis and the Nagas. You're settling one group on land that another group considers theirs. You're not solving a problem. You're creating a brand new, long-lasting one based on conflict over land and identity.
And really, that's the takeaway here. A strategy designed almost 200 years ago for simple frontier control has now morphed into the demographic and political fault lines that define the region's conflicts today. The seeds of today's problems were planted by a colonial administration that's long, long gone.
Which leaves us with this final, really critical question. When history itself is used to decide who belongs, whose story gets to be the truth? Because, as we've seen, these aren't just dusty old records. They are active battlegrounds in the fight for the present and the future.